Although we'd rather think about selling our products and services, we generally need to do at least a little bit of business with vendors in order to be ready to make those sales. This means needing to set up vendors in QuickBooks. We're talking a lot about vendors from whom we get products to sell, but vendors can also provide overhead or general supplies for everything from pens and paper to telephone or internet services, and even our lawn care. A vendor is simply anyone we pay money to for things that we use in our business. The process and even a lot of the actual fields of information we need to create vendors are the same as for customers and even for employees to a point. We are given the option to add vendors as part of the company file setup. That's actually a good time to do it if we have the time at that point. We can copy and paste it from sources like Excel, which we discussed in our chapter on working with lists when we were using the Add Multiple List Entries feature. It can also be done by physically importing lists, including from email, which is really great if we have the information somewhere else and want to get it into QuickBooks quickly. We also mentioned that most lists can be updated with new entries on the fly, so to speak, as we're actually creating things like invoices or purchase orders. At that time, if we enter a new vendor name, we'll be prompted to do either a quick add or to do a full setup. What does that leave us with? Well, we haven't actually addressed formally adding a vendor using a QuickBooks form to add one at a time. So let's give that last one a walkthrough and see how we can add vendors in QuickBooks using the vendor form. We're using the products sample file that comes with QuickBooks for Rock Castle Construction. And once we get into a QuickBooks company file, the question is, where do we find vendor information? And of course, the answer to that is, well, from a lot of places. Of course, we have a vendor's menu at the top, but all the vendor's menu is going to do for us in this case is give us the opportunity to display the vendor center. That's a couple of clicks too many if we have the home page open already, because at the very top center of the home page, we see the option for vendors, which we can also click to display the vendor center itself. From here, the option we want is actually the very first one we see on the very top left edge of the center, and that is to create a new vendor. We have the traditional new vendor option, as well as the option to use the table to add multiple vendors at the same time. We're going to select New Vendor and wait for the form to open. Now, just to make this screen a little bit easier to see, I'm going to go ahead and minimize the centers and the windows in the background. There we go. All we need to do is simply fill out all of the information. These types of forms are usually grouped into categories, and we can see those categories or tabs along the left-hand edge of the form. There's address info, payment settings, tax settings, account settings, and even one for additional info. The basic contact information and what people would consider to be probably the most relevant and important is on the first tab. Before we actually get started doing some data entry, though, I wanted to remind you of a couple of things. For many of us, it won't be a problem, but QuickBooks, like other software, does have a physical limit on how big or numerous things can be. One of those limits in QuickBooks 2015 is that our vendors, customers, employees, and other names lists, so all of those lists put together, cannot contain more than 14,500 names total. One way to help simplify these lists is to keep records simple by having one for vendors who may have separate locations. For example, if we buy supplies from a certain home improvement center that has many locations that we shop at often, we can just have one record for them in QuickBooks, unless there's a reason to separate them by location. We can also create a few general names, such as meals or taxis, if we tend to eat at a lot of one-time places or use whichever local cab company there is when we travel. Often, we can do this because we don't really need to ever report on them individually. They're going to go into expense categories, and that makes it easier to work with. It also helps eliminate any problem we may have with the 14,500 name limit on our lists. If the IRS wants to know specifically who we worked with, we should have receipts with actual names. But QuickBooks doesn't care to know them, so try to consolidate if you can, if you think this is going to be an issue. It also simplifies your list when you fill out things like bills and expenses. By the way, if the thought of having to try to physically count all of these names with all of these lists is somewhat daunting, which it probably should be, give this a try. If at any time in QuickBooks we press F2, which I have just done on my own computer, it brings up a wonderful screen that has lots of information on it. This is actually the product information screen. Here we can view a lot of different information, including things about our QuickBooks software itself. But if we take a look at the right-hand side of the screen, we'll see a category called List Information. This tells us that we have a total of 118 accounts, a total of 214 names, 147 customers, 54 vendors, 3 employees, and we could continue to scroll down. It even gives us information about how many items we have. In this case, we can see that we have 90 items in our inventory or services that we offer. This window is literally a treasure trove of information that we might need to know at any given time. So don't forget F2. We'll go ahead and close this out by clicking the X on the upper right side of the window, which brings us back to our vendor form. So far, we've learned how adding vendors is not the most intricate of things that we do in QuickBooks. Part of the reason is because QuickBooks allows us to use many different ways of getting information into the system. In part 2 of this topic, we'll explore the fields that are available and how to finish up entering our vendor information. In part 1 of this topic, we got started accessing vendor information in QuickBooks and adding new vendors to our company file. Now let's get into the details of filling in the vendor information using the new vendor form. Now it may seem like the easiest part, but the very first field we want to address is the actual vendor name. It may seem like a lot of fields are obvious, and we're not going to talk about all of them. But if there's a little tip or a trick or some insight that we can offer, we'll go ahead and discuss those, and this is one of those. Both vendor name and customer name is unique. Therefore, if you're going to use any kind of abbreviations or coding, this is the place to put it in. It's also a good idea to use naming conventions so that everything is consistent. For example, if a company name started with the word the, would you want that to be the very first part of the name? Or would you put the most important part of the name in as this particular entry? I think you get the idea. This is the field that will uniquely identify every vendor from every other vendor in our company file. The name of our vendor is going to be AAA Interior Supplies. I prefer to move through forms by simply pressing the Tab key. It keeps my hands on the keyboard and makes it simple and progressive. But of course, if you prefer to use the mouse, you can do that as well. This places the cursor into the Opening Balance field. This field is available when we are initially setting up a new vendor, as well as customers. It seems tantalizing, but while we can put in a balance owed, in this case, what we're doing is leaving out the details of open transactions for which we still owe money. You know, little insignificant details like when we made the purchase and what we actually purchased. Those, of course, are not insignificant at all. Instead of using this quick and easy method, it's better to pick a start date and then enter actual bills and invoices for any current balances that we have. That way, the information we need to process and document them correctly will all be in QuickBooks. I know, the best way is usually not the easiest or fastest way, but there is a reason it is best, and it will pay off in the long run. So we're going to leave our opening balance empty. That means we can simply continue to tab, and now we're ready to put in the company name. If our company name and our vendor name should be the same, I like to just go back up where we were and copy and paste. That way we make sure that we are absolutely consistent. It also provides a second time to kind of do a check for typos. And what we can see more easily here is that we lack a space between interior and supplies. We can always come in and change these things later, but especially when it comes to the vendor name at the top. If we can make this accurate and not change it at all, it's going to help ensure that our records stay connected to each other, whereas making a change later on might cause problems. Now we get down to something called full name. This is important for your primary contact. It will basically be used on any correspondence or communications, and so this is really the first person and the primary contact with whom we would work in a company. We'll add in just a couple pieces of this information. The person we work with is named Mark, so we will put in Mr. Mark, leave out the middle initial, and we'll put in the last name. Putting in a title is also useful because it shows respect, and it also helps us remember what their title is in case we need to call the business and ask for them generically or find out other information. When it gets to the contact information for phone numbers, email addresses, and websites, it appears that we have basically 8 different fields that we can fill in. The main stuff, of course, is here. main and work phone, mobile phones, fax numbers, regular email, CC emails, and even websites. But what we need to remember is that there are drop downs here. So if any of these labels are not appropriate, we can actually choose from a variety of other labels. I think there are about 24 of them in total, but I want you to notice that we have updated things that certainly was not in QuickBooks 5 years ago. Things like LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter addresses. Since social media is one of the primary ways we communicate with and find out about what companies are doing, this is a really nice option. Hopefully, being able to display up to 8 of these different categories will be enough to help us get in touch with or communicate with our vendors. At the bottom of the screen, we have the option to put in some address details, and that's usually a good idea since we need to send things like purchase orders and bills to vendors. What happens is we have some information that's being copied down. Primarily, we have our company name. This will also show up on purchase orders and checks, and then the name of our contact. Another nice feature is after we get this filled out, we can simply copy it over to the right and have it added as a second address as well. Now, when we try to do that, you'll notice that QuickBooks displays a window that's trying to help us make sure that we put in complete address information and that the information goes into the right spot. The address name, the address itself, city, state, and zip code, as well as country, and we can even keep notes. This is to help if we ever do things like mail merges to make sure that everything shows up in the appropriate spot. We're going to simply cancel out of this for now and review just a couple of very important things. First of all, we want to make sure that our vendor name is accurate and does not have any typos. Secondly, we want to make sure that we fill in as much information as is necessary to use for things like purchase orders, correspondence, and communication. This is what most people consider to be the core of information that must be kept for vendors. But of course, we have more categories or tabs on the left-hand side of the window, and let's run through those fairly quickly. The payment settings is a fairly simple tab, and it is not required, but it does allow us to put in the account number. Now, this is our account number with the vendor. We also can enter a credit limit, payment terms, and even a billing rate level if any of those are appropriate. Notice this is also where we get to designate once again what we want the printed name to appear on a check. This can be different than the other names that we used for our basic contact information. If we add information such as account numbers, those will print in memos when we print checks to the vendor, as well as, of course, having the name appear appropriately. Knowing our default payment terms is also a really good idea. For example, we may be eligible to get discounts if we pay early, and that's something we want to take advantage of if at all possible. If we then move to the tax settings, we'll see that this is another fairly straightforward screen. There are a variety of times when we may need to know what our vendor's tax ID number is. It's either a TIN or an EIN, an employee identification number. If we enter this here, we can then use that when we prepare reports and tax forms. One of those tax forms is whether this vendor is eligible for or needs a 1099. And there is a help button here if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Generally, the only people who need to receive a 1099 are people who are not incorporated and that you paid more than $3,000 to throughout the year. Of course, you always need to check with your accountant or your taxing authority to be sure if you need to create them or not. This information is simply used for the 1099. If you're going to create one, then you need to have the vendor's tax number so that that can be applied to their 1099 when it's printed at year end. Moving on down to account settings. This is where we designate what types of things we purchase from this particular vendor. This is coming from our chart of accounts. So if this is a vendor that we buy insurance from, then we would choose one of our insurance categories. But as we've been discussing so much in this particular section, if this is somebody that we buy inventory items from, then we want to use one of our COGS accounts. Fortunately, on the right side of this list, it tells us the type of account it is. So if we purchase goods that we're going to resell or that we use to manufacture things we'll resell, it's probably going to be our good old COGS account. And of course, lastly, we do have an additional info tab that has things like vendor types if we categorize them, as well as custom fields. But with all of that said, and that's a lot of information, when we get all of this filled out, we simply need to click or tap OK. And if we've done anything that QuickBooks thinks is questionable, like in this case, we designated them as a 1099 vendor but did not put in their tax ID, we can simply say yes or no to continue in the way that we need to. We are not going to enter that now, so we'll say no. If we bring up our vendor center, there's one more thing I want to show you that's very useful. And that is that we often have multiple contacts for one company, but the form only allowed us to put in one contact. No worries though. If we select our vendor from the vendor center, and then on the right-hand side of the screen where we see the details about the vendor, we activate the Contacts tab, which is right about the middle of the screen. Then from the bottom, we can click Manage Contacts and choose Add New. This is how we can add additional contacts from the same company. Notice that there are some similar fields, but certainly a restricted set of fields. It's not everything about the vendor, only about contacts that we would need to keep. That's a nice feature, but one that I think kind of hides from people and they don't know that it's possible, and then they try to get creative with the vendor window, which is not what we want to do. Now remember, the number of vendors we need to enter and how much information we keep is really a company decision. Small service-based companies may not have many vendors. Larger manufacturing companies may have hundreds. The more information you have, the more options you have to manage your relationships with your vendors. But the balance between that and spending too much time entering information is really a matter of your specific business needs. Vendors are your supply chain, the source for the products and services that we use, not only to sell directly to our customers, but also to run our business as a whole. So they are a critical part of your record keeping, and they deserve diligence and respect as you add them to your QuickBooks system.